On the front end, this bill makes reasonable changes to federal law to more appropriately tailor sentences for drug offenders. It does not eliminate mandatory minimums, but reduces them for certain offenders. It takes a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, to the federal sentencing scheme. Among other things, the bill reduces some of the harsher sentences for federal drug offenders. It reduces the penalty for a third federal drug offense from life imprisonment to not less than 25 years. This is a sensible change. We want to punish repeat offenders, but we do not want our federal prisons to become nursing homes.
House will be in order. Members, please take conversations off the floor. House will be in order. Members, please take conversations off the floor. Members in the rear of the chamber. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, the House is not in order.
The gentleman's correct. Members to my right in the rear of the chamber, please cease conversations. What purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and concur in Senate amendment to the House amendment to S756, the First Step Act of 2018.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 756, an act to reauthorize and amend the Marine Debris Act to promote international action to reduce marine debris and for other purposes. Senate amendment to House amendment.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Goodlatte, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on S756 currently under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I recognize myself for such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, today, in what may very well be my last floor statement as a member of this esteemed body, I rise in strong support of the First Step Act. The bipartisan and bicameral bill before us is a meaningful and historic criminal justice reform measure. This is also an issue that I have dedicated much of my work to as chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Nearly 4 years ago, I and former Ranking Member Conyers created a criminal justice reform initiative at the Judiciary Committee to address the significant congressional interest in criminal justice reform from members who do and do not serve on the Judiciary Committee. The purpose of the initiative was to develop bipartisan legislation to address several facets of the federal criminal justice system, including overcriminalization, prison and reentry reform, sentencing reform, protecting citizens through improved criminal procedures and policing strategies, and civil asset forfeiture reform. In addressing these issues, The committee relied on the work of the Overcriminalization Task Force, which held 9 hearings on a variety of criminal justice topics during the 113th Congress, as well as the information provided to the committee by interested members during the committee's listening session in June of 2015. The work of that initiative has already yielded tremendous results. For instance, the Rapid DNA Act is helping local police departments by allowing them to submit DNA records that are generated by rapid DNA systems outside an accredited laboratory to be uploaded to NDIS. This is important as it can confirm or exonerate a suspect in a matter of hours instead of days or even weeks. That bill was signed into law by President Trump last year. The Comprehensive Justice and Mental Health Act of 2015 promotes public safety and community health by facilitating collaboration among the criminal justice, juvenile justice, mental health treatment, and substance abuse systems to ensure those with mental illness receive the treatment and help they need. That bill became law as part of the 21st Century Cures Act. While those 2 laws are incredible steps forward, the measure we have before us today is the crown jewel of the criminal justice reform. The First Step Act before us today couples front-end and back-end reform to our criminal justice system. 7 months ago, this body overwhelmingly passed the first iteration of the First Step Act. While it only contained back-end prison reforms, it was a very real and very important first step. During consideration of that bill, many of my colleagues voted against the measure because it did not contain any front-end sentencing reforms. At the time, I noted that I support front-end reforms, and since then worked with our colleagues in the Senate to ensure that they are included in the bill before us today. On the front end, this bill makes reasonable changes to federal law to more appropriately tailor sentences for drug offenders. It does not eliminate mandatory minimums, but reduces them for certain offenders. It takes a scalpel, not a sledgehammer, to the federal sentencing scheme. Among other things, the bill reduces some of the harsher sentences for federal drug offenders. It reduces the penalty for a 3rd federal drug offense from life imprisonment to not less than 25 years. This is a sensible change. We want to punish repeat offenders, but we do not want our federal prisons to become nursing homes. Importantly, this bipartisan legislation backstops these sentencing reductions by ensuring violent offenders are eligible for sentencing enhancements under the drug statutes. Congress enacted these minimum sentences 30 years ago to protect our communities from violent offenders. The bill ensures they carry out that mission. On the back end, the First Step Act places a new focus on rehabilitation. The bill establishes a risk and needs assessment as the basis of an effective recidivism reduction program, and more importantly, an efficient and effective federal prison system. The First Step Act will incentivize prisoners to participate in evidence-based recidivism reduction programs, production activities, and jobs that will actually reduce their risk of recidivism. Finally, this comprehensive package contains the reauthorization of the Second Chance Act, a provision sponsored by the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Sensenbrenner. This measure authorizes funding for both public and private entities, including nonprofit organizations, to evaluate and improve academic and vocational education for offenders in prisons, jails, and juvenile facilities. Reentry is a vital component of criminal justice reform. Nearly every federal prisoner will someday be released. We all have an interest in ensuring ex-inmates become productive members of society. I'd be remiss if I did not point out the overwhelming bipartisan support from outside interest groups that the First Step Act has received. Numerous organizations on both the left and the right have enthusiastically endorsed this bill. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the chief House champions of the First Step Act, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, who in January will take the position of ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, and who, along with the new chairman, Mr. Nadler, I hope, will continue the quest for more criminal justice reform. And I also want to acknowledge the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries. They worked tirelessly to advance this legislation, and both Mr. Collins and Mr. Jeffries should be applauded for their bipartisan approach to this issue. I urge my colleagues to support this historic legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of S-756, or the amendments thereto, the First Step Act as passed in the Senate. This legislation has traveled a long journey to get to this point. Along the way, various aspects of the bill have changed. Although I do not agree with all of the changes, on balance, the measure has greatly improved, thanks to the hard work of many members on both sides of the aisle from the House and the Senate. Before I get to the substance of the bill, I want to recognize some of the people most responsible for getting us here today. There are a number of champions of criminal justice reform in the Senate, but I particularly want to recognize and thank Senators Dick Durbin and Chuck Grassley for their commitment to getting a bill that includes important sentencing reforms to the President's desk. In the House, I want to thank my Judiciary Committee colleagues, Representatives Hakeem Jeffries and Doug Collins, who worked together and with us to achieve a bipartisan compromise that is the foundation of this bill. I also thank the ranking member of the Crime Subcommittee, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, who has helped hold this legislation to a high standard, knowing that so many are counting on us to address longstanding injustices. There are many others in the House who have fought for substantial reform for years, upon whose labors this bill was built, who deserve our thanks. Finally, let me recognize Judiciary Committee Chairman Bob Goodlatte, who is retiring at the end of this term. He and I have not always seen eye to eye on a range of issues, I think it's fair to say, including some aspects of this bill. But I appreciate his efforts as chairman over the past 6 years to work with my Democratic colleagues on the committee. Today, we join together in supporting an important bipartisan bill. I thank him for his leadership in bringing us to the final stage of its consideration and for his service to Congress and to the country. As for the bill itself, S-756 makes a number of reforms to our federal sentencing laws. It also establishes a new system to provide incentives to some federal prisoners to participate in programs that will reduce the risk that they will commit crimes once they are released. The prison reform provisions of this bill are similar to those in H.R. 5682, the House-passed measure with the same name as this new bill. The bill before us today includes provisions intended to address concerns that I and many others raised about the fairness of the new recidivism reduction system for federal prisons. For instance, this revised bill establishes an independent review committee of outside experts to assist the Justice Department in the development of the risk and needs assessment system that would determine the programming for inmates, their risk categories, and their eligibility for early entry into pre-release custody. Also, the bill expands the options for early pre-release custody to include supervised release. Changes such as these, in order to substantially authorize more funding for the expansion of programming to reduce the risk of recidivism by inmates, help make this new system more fair. In the other direction, however, I'm disappointed the bill excludes additional categories of offenders from being able to earn early entry into pre-release custody, reducing the risk reduction incentives for those who perhaps need it the most. The prison reform provisions of this bill also include a number of very positive changes, such as banning shackling of pregnant and postpartum inmates, fixing the calculation of time off earned for good behavior, improving application of compassionate release, and providing other measures to improve the welfare of federal inmates. In addition, the bill reauthorizes the Second Chance Act, a historically bipartisan effort to help ex-offenders successfully re-enter their communities after having served their time. Critically, this bill would not only implement these reforms to our prison system, but it also takes a crucial first step toward addressing grave concerns about our sentencing laws, which have for years fed a national crisis of mass incarceration. It was largely for the absence of provisions changing our sentencing laws that some of us opposed the House version of this bill. But that exclusion has been remedied, and we now support this bill wholeheartedly. Among the sentencing reforms contained in this bill are expanding the existing safety valve to allow judges greater authority to sentence low-level, nonviolent offenders below the mandatory minimum, applying the crack cocaine sentence reductions from the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 retroactively, reducing certain minimum sentences for recidivist drug offenders, and stopping the unfair stacking of mandatory sentencing enhancements for certain repeat firearms offenders. Although we must do far more to address the injustice of mandatory minimum sentences and other policies that lead to mass incarceration, these changes recognize the fundamental unfairness of a system that imposes lengthy imprisonment that is not based on the facts and circumstances of each offender and each case. This legislation is not the end of the discussion. As the bill's title suggests, it is a first step. It will not solve long-standing problems with our criminal justice system, issues and injustices that will require more aggressive and comprehensive reforms in the future. But it does make substantial reforms, and it does demonstrate that we can work together to make the system more fair in ways that will also reduce crime and victimization. Therefore, I support this bill, and I ask my colleagues to do the same. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time, and I ask unanimous consent that the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, be permitted to control the time.
Without objection. The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Speaker, I also ask unanimous consent for the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, to manage the rest of the time on this side of the aisle.
Without objection. Does the gentleman yield time? Gentleman from Georgia.
At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'll yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleague and Chairman Goodlatte as he is leaving now to continue his quest to go out running, and that is to another hearing. But I want to thank Chairman Goodlatte for all that he has done and everything that he has expressed, not only for our committee, but also for this bill, and also for Mr. Nadler and his support coming forward in this. We appreciate the work that they have done and what we are seeing today. But, Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of S-756, the First Step Act. This is historic legislation that will make our community safer, save taxpayer money, and start addressing the revolving door of incarceration and crime by helping formerly incarcerated prisoners get a second chance at life. I've said this so many times over the last couple of years, this is simply an M&M issue. This is about monies and morals. This is about doing good with the taxpayer dollar and also giving people a chance from a moral perspective to have a second chance. Legislation we are considering today is a culmination of extensive work with our colleagues across the aisle and in the Senate. I can proudly say this is a truly bipartisan, bicameral bill. I want to thank my friend and colleague, Hakeem Jeffries, who has been instrumental in this effort. We wouldn't be here today without his commitment to improving not only the justice system, but individual lives. He has been a partner in many things, and this is a culmination of a large step, and I want to thank him for that. This bill is the result of compromise, reached through extensive negotiations with House, Senate, and the White House, all of whom want to address serious problems within our federal criminal justice system. The federal prison population has increased from less than 25,000 in 1980 to over 183,000 today. Each year, tens of thousands of federal prisoners return to their communities after completing their sentences. In fact, Mr. Speaker, if you take state, federal, and local individuals incarcerated, 95% of them at some point will come home. That is a question for each of us. That is a moral imperative to each of us on how we are punishing and also how we are preparing them for reentry. Unfortunately, almost half of these individuals reoffend after release. This cycle of recidivism drains taxpayer dollars, it strains limited resources at the Department of Justice, and undermines community safety. First, this legislation will provide low-risk inmates with incentives and resources they need to develop new skills and break their bad habits so that they emerge from prison as Americans ready to be productive members of society instead of repeat offenders. Secondly, the legislation includes carefully tailored sentencing reforms to address inherent disparities in our sentencing laws while keeping violent criminals from the incentives and benefits of the bill. Amending our sentencing law requires care and balance, and I believe the negotiations over this bill have resulted in that balance. After many years of seeing how this has worked on the state level through many studies and many evidence-based approaches, we are seeing this work. Finally, the legislation includes the Second Chance Reauthorization Act, authored by my friend and colleague, Congressman Sensenbrenner. This legislation will reauthorize and reform grant programs that have been crucial to states working to improve reentry services and to increase public safety. But this is also sort of special from my perspective as well. For in the home state, my home state of Georgia, Governor Nathan Deal, a former distinguished member of this body, went home and began spearheading criminal justice reform legislation that has made Georgia safer while saving taxpayer dollars. States like Georgia, Texas, South Carolina have shown us that you can reduce both crime rates and incarceration rates through evidence-based approaches and carefully tailored sentencing laws. The First Step Act, which is based on these states' successful reforms, uses evidence-based approach to drive down the recidivism rate among federal prisoners. Also, Mr. Speaker, the President Trump recently said this is an issue that unifies people, and it has unified a broad range of my colleagues in the Congress. Speaker Ryan has led on this issue for a long time, and today's bill would not be possible without his work and the work of Chairman Goodlatte, Congressman Jeffries, Sheila Jackson Lee, and so many others, our majority leader. As we continue on, it also transcended the House and went into the Senate with Chairman Grassley, Senators Cornyn, Perdue, Lee, Durbin, and Whitehouse have worked and negotiated tirelessly, and that many legislators that have worked to reach this compromise. And yes, it is a compromise. It is something that we have worked on and studied and worked to find something that works for the American people. I would also like to thank Jared Kushner and the Office of American Innovation for all the work and support in this legislation. When he came to the table with a full-on passion to find results and to get solutions, and for that, Jared has been invaluable in this process. Mr. Speaker, when I came to Washington, I came to legislate. I came to be a part of representing my district and my state in this country. And I'm proud that my colleagues and I were able to do so here with the First Step Act, a bill that gives prisoners a second chance and makes communities safer. But finally, there's a group out there that is pretty amazing, a group from all sides of the political spectrum, hundreds upon thousands of advocates across the country adding their voices to the reform effort. Their commitment, focus, and drive helped us get to this point, and today we have a chance to move forward with historic, meaningful legislation to improve lives and make communities safer, save taxpayer money, and make the judicial system fair. But Mr. Speaker, as you well know, none of us stand here without help from others, and I am blessed in my office to have people who are dedicated to not only finding solutions, but sticking with it. John Farrell in my office, who is my counsel, who has worked on this tirelessly. In fact, Mr. Speaker, I'm probably going to have some days built in for him to take off because he's not slept much in the last month. But he has tirelessly fought for this and worked with both the Senate and the White House to make sure this is an approach that will work and do what it's intended. And Erica Barker in my office, through even the trials of going through her own law school experience, has been invaluable. Along with the rest of my office and the rest of the folks that we have named already, this is the time to pass something that makes sense, that has been studied, that is backed up by evidence. It is a thing that the founders, I believe, had envisioned. We fight where we need to, but when we can find agreement, we find agreement for the American people. And again, Mr. Speaker, it's about M&Ms. It's about monies and morals, being smart on money and giving people the chance that they need. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Let me indicate to the American people happy holidays and thank the gentleman from Georgia for his bipartisan reach to help us understand the impact of this bill. It's my privilege now to yield 4 minutes to the original co-sponsor of this legislation and to thank him for his embrace of all of us as we worked our way through this legislation. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Hakeem Jeffries, the incoming chair of the Democratic Caucus.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the distinguished gentlelady from Texas, Sheila Jackson Lee, for yielding and for her tremendous leadership on the criminal justice reform effort over the years. I also want to thank all of the members of the House Judiciary Committee, in particular Chairman Goodlatte, as well as Jerry Nadler, and of course Cedric Richmond and Karen Bass, who were phenomenal assets to this effort. And let me thank my good friend Doug Collins, who has been a tremendous force of nature as it relates to making sure that this Congress did something about overcriminalization in America from beginning, middle, and end. It's been an honor to work with you on a wide variety of things in this great body, but in particular on this effort to break the back of the prison industrial complex. I thank Doug Collins for his tremendous leadership. In 1971, President Nixon declared drug abuse public enemy number one. It was the beginning of the failed war on drugs. At that point in time, there were less than 350,000 people incarcerated in America. Today, there are 2.2 million. We incarcerate more people in the United States of America than any other country in the world. We have 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's incarcerated individuals. It is a scandal. It is a stain on our democratic society. It's not a Democratic problem or a Republican problem. It's an American problem. And today, the House of Representatives comes together as Americans to begin to solve it. Democrats and Republicans, the left and the right, progressives and conservatives, the National Urban League and the Koch brothers, the House and the Senate, as well as the Trump administration, proving that good things can happen under the Capitol dome when we set aside partisan bickering to solve problems on behalf of the American people. And what a problem that we are endeavoring to solve with the First Step Act, making sure that currently incarcerated individuals, the victims of mass incarceration in this country, can successfully re-enter society, transform themselves, become productive citizens, dramatically reduce recidivism, and save taxpayer dollars. That's what the First Step Act is all about. It will also strike a blow against the unfair sentencing laws that were put into place as a result of the failed war on drugs and provide some retroactive relief to those individuals sentenced unjustly as a result of the disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. The First Step Act is a product of work that this body has decided to do out of recognition that we cannot allow over-criminalization to continue to persist in this country. Now, the mass incarceration has been with us, epidemic has been with us for over 40 years. It will not take simply the waving of a singular legislative magic wand to eradicate it, but it will require sustained effort, sustained commitment, sustained intensity, and a meaningful first step. That is what we are doing today. I urge all of my colleagues to support this effort to reform our criminal justice system in a manner consistent with the notion of liberty and justice for all. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I yield 2 minutes to my friend from Texas, Mr. Comer.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Collins, for yielding. One of the highlights of my being in Congress was getting a call from Ed Meese asking if I would work with him on criminal justice reform. I was glad to do that. It was amazing having the ACLU and Heritage working together and groups working together, but more of our focus was on requiring intent to be proven before you could lock people up, take away their freedom. Things like the 5,000 or so federal crimes that allow regulations, violation of regulations that no elected official has ever participated in, to be the basis for somebody losing their freedom. Those were important. But that's not what this criminal justice reform bill is about. It's why some call it a jailbreak bill. Under the bill, there are some good things, improvements on rehabilitation, but unfortunately, and I'm glad that Ted Cruz's amendment passed in the Senate, so carjackers, violent carjackers are not going to be allowed to have a chance to have their time cut. But there are 1,466 coercion, enticement of children into sex crimes. They will be eligible. There's 5,934 offenders relating to bank robbery involving violence or risk of death. They'll be eligible. There are others involving violence on officers, law enforcement officers. Look, on behalf of the sheriffs, the prosecutors, people like me who were, I was a state felony judge, we worked very hard to come together on a proper sentence. Plea agreements were made for a lesser sentence. The Sheriff's Association National says they stand firmly opposed to this very dangerous bill. Crime rates will go up within 2 years if this bill passes, which apparently it will, but somebody needed to state what's coming when we do this. I yield back.
Gentlelady from Texas.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Let me take the tone of Mr. Goodlatte, Mr. Collins, and Mr. Jeffries for saying that this is a momentous occasion. And what I'm grateful for, Mr. Speaker, is the faith community, the advocates who have been working with families for decades, mothers who welcome home sons and daughters, prisoners or ex-prisoners like those I met just a week ago at the Houston Reentry Program who indicated that they could not find a job, members of the Congressional Black Caucus, our present chair, Mr. Richmond, our chair-elect, Ms. Bass, people from all walks of life have recognized that this is not going to increase crime, but quite the opposite. Through our faith, we understand that humanity and the recognition of someone's dignity helps them to be a contributing member of society. So I rise to support this bill that includes the First Step and the Sentencing Reform Reduction Act. I rise because so many people have worked over the years to ensure that this bill will work. It is important to note what we are overcoming. And the ACLU said over the past 4 to 5 decades, U.S. criminal justice policies have driven an increase in incarceration rates that is unprecedented in this country and unmatched elsewhere in the world. Our country is over 20% of the world's incarcerated persons, despite having less than 5% of the world's population. In 2015, it was estimated that 6.7 million persons were involved in the adult correctional system and almost 2.2 million in prisons or jail, 180,000 in the federal system, all costing us money and the value of those human beings that can serve their country. So I'm grateful for the work that we came together on, that we overcame some of the challenges. I want to mention Mr. John Lewis, who is the conscience of this Congress, who worked with us to ensure that sentencing reform would be part of the ultimate bill. I want to acknowledge other members of the other body, Senator Durbin Grassley, Senator Harris, and of course, Senator Booker, among others. I want to thank Mr. Goodlatte in his last bill for his commitment to moving criminal justice reform, even in the last Congress, and the new ranking member and soon-to-be chair, Mr. Nadler, who put all of his energies in ensuring that we could effectively move this bill. We worked with Senator Durbin, we worked with Senator Grassley, who wanted to make sure that this was a wonderful partnership, the same kind of partnership that my good friend Mr. Jeffries spoke of, conservative viewpoints, religious viewpoints, and those advocacy groups who had fought for years against mandatory minimums. We've come a long way. Justice has to be equal and it has to be fair. It has to be righteous and reasonable. And in that, it has to have any number of those participating. Eric Holder, who worked on this issue, recognized that we had to have a partnership between these two fine elements, reduction and as well the First Step Act, sentencing reduction. I know that this bill and hope it will be signed because the President indicated he wants the finest prison reform bill that we could have anywhere. Let me proclaim on the floor that we have made that giant step, but we've added the opportunity for almost 5,000 people to see their families under supervision by sentencing reduction over 50,000 over a 10-year period. Not individuals that haven't had the opportunity for training, for job training, for counseling, for opioid treatment, all matched together with the sentencing and prison reform bill. So we've had elements like the safety valve, retroactive application of fair sentencing. To all of my friends in the advocacy community, you have been victorious and I thank you. Reforms enhance mandatory minimum sentences for prior drug offenses, recognizing that the crack cocaine disparity was destructive in the work that we have tried to do. Stacking, Let me also say that there was concern that there be no oversight over this bill. I'm glad that they took my amendment for an independent review committee, so the discretion of wardens and the DOJ are not random, but they in fact will have an independent outside committee to look at this matter. I'm grateful that my friend, Mr. Danny Davis, who's worked so hard, got his second chance reauthorization in the bill, which is extremely important. I am so grateful, and you'll hear from Congresswoman Bass for her ongoing passionate concern about the treatment of pregnant women, and I look forward to working with her in the future. We have groups like the ACLU, the Brennan Group, the NAACP, and others who have worked hard on this type of legislation, and we are grateful for their continued insight and keeping us honest as we move forward. I want to acknowledge, if I could, the idea again that there will be those who will be preying upon us. In this season of caring and giving, I hope the nation will be praying for a better nation, praying for the opportunity for people who went astray, and to recognize that what we have put in this bill are limits to ensure that these persons released will have the right kind of training and counseling, because we have increased the funding, we have worked with the groups that need to be worked with, and we have protected pregnant prisoners. And finally, Mr. Speaker, something that I hope will grow in our compassion, that we have reformed an aspect of the criminal justice system as it relates to juveniles, and that is that there is no more solitary confinement. I appreciate the sponsors accepting that from both myself and Mr. Booker, Senator Booker. It is a bill of compassion. It is not a bill of crime. It is a bill that America can be proud of. With that, I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this time it is my honor and privilege to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from Wisconsin who has provided such leadership on this issue and many others for this Congress, and it's my privilege to now give him 3 minutes.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for yielding. Congress has spent years talking about reducing crime, enacting fair sentencing laws, and restoring lives. Today we're putting our words into action, and this is historic. I'm proud to have been a leader in this effort for over a decade. First, introducing the original Second Chance Act with the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Danny Davis, then serving as chairman of the Overcriminalization Task Force in 2013, and introducing a comprehensive criminal justice reform bill with the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Bobby Scott. This Congress, I sponsored the Second Chance Reauthorization Act, which helps prisoners rejoin their families and re-enter society. I am happy to note that the First Step Act includes this reauthorization. The Second Chance Act was originally passed with bipartisan support and signed into law in 2008. This first-of-its-kind legislation authorized federal grants for vital programs aimed at improving the reentry process and reducing recidivism. Grants have been used for a wide range of improved supervision practices and reentry programs, including employment assistance and job skills training, treatment for mental and substance abuse disorders, education, housing assistance, family services, and mentoring. Reauthorizing the Second Chance Act is an essential step to reducing our prison population and improving the overall criminal justice system. By providing the resources needed to coordinate reentry services and the policies of state and local levels, this legislation will ensure that the tax dollars spent on corrections do not simply fuel a revolving door in and out of prison. I urge my colleagues to support the First Step Act and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from Texas.
I'm delighted to yield to the incoming chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and a member of the House Judiciary Committee, the gentlelady from California, Karen Bass.
How much time does the gentlelady yield?
2 minutes.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the First Step Act. For 40 years, our failure to adequately reform our criminal justice system has resulted in punitive mandatory minimum sentences and mass incarceration. African Americans, Latinos, and Native Americans have borne the brunt of this legacy. Between 1980 and 2014, there was a 700% increase in the number of women in custody. This was nearly twice the rate of male imprisonment. Women are often held for nonviolent, low-level drug offenses. Unfortunately, these women are entering a male-centered penal system that is not designed to meet their physical or mental health needs. What is needed is criminal justice reform that understands that women in the system have unique needs. This is the first step toward addressing the needs of women. Improving the health outcomes of pregnant women who are in custody is in the First Step Act. My language would restrict the use of restraints on pregnant women, which increases the risk of complications during childbirth. Some of the stories shared by women who were restrained during pregnancy are horrific. One woman was shackled in labor and dislocated her hip. She experienced stomach muscle tears and an umbilical hernia. She was left with permanent deformities and pain. Another woman tripped over her shackles, fell to the ground, and miscarried at 20 weeks. The idea that a woman needs to be shackled at the end of her pregnancy or in labor and delivery as though she is going to escape while delivering a child is ridiculous, brutal, and, in my opinion, a human rights abuse. One mother recounted being shackled after having an emergency cesarean section. She stated, with the weight of the shackles on my stomach, it felt like they were ripping open my C-section. Mr. Speaker, do we have no shame? This egregious abuse of human rights in federal prisons must end. I hope Congress continues to address this issue. In the 116th Congress, we will continue to move the needle forward by developing comprehensive criminal justice reform that specifically looks at the needs of women in the system. I want to thank the members who supported this legislation, and I want to thank Representative Jeffries, Sheila Jackson Lee, Representative Collins, and Nadler for introducing and passing the First Step Act. I yield my time.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, it is my privilege to give and yield 2 minutes to a gentleman who has become a friend on this issue, one that I remember sitting in Houston talking about this, and also to say now that it is coming to reality. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Richmond.
Gentleman from Louisiana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to commend Representative Collins for success on this very important issue. So oftentimes people ask what is required of us, and it is to do justice and love mercy, and that's exactly what the First Step Act does. Is it a perfect bill? No, it's not. Is it a first step? Yes, and it's a good first step. We have, for too long, we've been past the law of diminishing returns on our criminal justice system. Every dollar that we spend on incarceration actually makes our neighborhoods and our communities less safe. So, does this bill address the strained relationships between police and the communities that they serve? Yes. Does it address the criminalization of poverty? No. And it leaves many sentences, unjust sentences in place. However, there's no doubt in my mind that this bill is a positive step in the right direction. It expands safety valve provisions that allow judges to block unfair sentences. It rolls back stacking rules that allow defendants to be charged with multiple crimes for a single incident. It prohibits the shackling of pregnant prisoners. It would also provide $75 million per year for programming to help prisoners prepare for life after incarceration. And it would also allow early release to some prisoners who participate. More than 4,000 prisoners will be eligible for release under this program. This bill also includes an amendment I introduced in Judiciary Committee that would ensure that the prison reform provisions of the bill would apply retroactively to all prisoners sentenced after 1987. But what it does is it restores many of our family units and corrects the overcorrection we made during the crack epidemic in the early 90s. And also what it does is send a message to the country that we realize our mistake in how we handled crack cocaine and substance abuse. And now that we see the opioid epidemic and we are adjusting our approach to that, more loving, more substance abuse, more of a mental health crisis when we talk about it, and we're going to go back and do the same for the cocaine and crack addiction. So with that, let me just thank all of the parties involved, Congressman Jeffries, Collins, Goodlatte, Ranking Member Nadler, Sheila Jackson Lee, and other committee members for bringing this legislation to the floor. Thank you again, and I yield back.
Mr. Speaker, at this point I will reserve, but I'm also inform the gentlelady that we're ready to close at this point. So if she's ready to close, we receive the close.
Gentlelady from Texas. Gentlelady from Texas has 1 1/4 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Georgia has 2 minutes remaining.
2 minutes. Thank you.
Let me thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and let me quickly move to my closing by really re-emphasizing happy holidays to the American people and thank our colleagues for recognizing the humanity of all individuals. Just in closing, imagine you're a mother, child, or loved one of an incarcerated person that was robbed by a system that played Russian roulette with his or her life because that system decided they were criminals rather than victims of a public health crisis or of a bad start in life or a lack of resources as a child. This bill recognizes that people start in life in many different ways, but they can be saved. They can be relevant. They can be with their families. So I am grateful for the amendments added, the protection of juveniles that will not be in solitary confinement, and I'm grateful for the independent review committee that indicates that there will be an oversight on how wardens issue the earned good time and how they're treating those who are incarcerated, an independent review committee in the Institute of Justice. Finally, I would offer to say we have money, and that money is at least a quarter of a billion dollars in terms of the amount of money that we will have over a period of time, some 250 million. It is approximate amount. Let me make the right number. At least in that figure that we have that will be invested in this particular bill. Finally, a bill that has been around for a very long time, the Second Chance Act, has a new lease on life, and that will be part of the bill, and we will continue to work with our colleagues going forward to emphasize the redemption of those who are trying to do right. I yield back.
Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we close up this debate, this is one of those times, Mr. Speaker, when I really come to this well and understand and discuss from this podium that things we do here matter. There's so many times we pass paper around this floor, we pass it and talk about bills in terms of line numbers and what it will do here to code numbers. But at the end of the day, this is one that actually has faces behind the lines. It has faces of those who are currently incarcerated that now have a chance to have some programs so that when they do get out, they go home and are productive citizens. It has faces behind the lines of those right now who will be making mistakes, making bad choices, even as we speak here on this floor, Mr. Speaker, but will have the opportunity to have a redemption in their life. You know, we've heard opposition, and there have been some others that have opposition. I've even been said, well, you're soft on crime, you're not helping law enforcement, although we have, you know, folks like the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Fraternal Order of Police, National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, National District Attorneys, some that don't want to come on, and I understand that. But I stand before you as the son of a Georgia State Trooper. Someone who has been there when I watched my father go out and do his job when others didn't want to. When I know that this bill will help in the long run, not only helping with not only the redemptive part, but also making sure that when people come out, they're not committing more crimes. When we're saving money and helping people, we're helping law enforcement do their job. When we understand this, I've also heard that from others that have sort of dismissed the data from states that said that this is not something that is evidence-based. It is working in conservative states. It's working in some liberal states, but it's working in places like Georgia and Texas and Oklahoma and Kentucky. This is where this works. Some said, well, we don't need to do anything because we need to punish them. Some are so looking backwards that all I'll say to this is, Mr. Speaker, how's it working out for us right now? Over 50% of these folks are recidivizing in a short term after getting out of prison. These are folks going back in and committing more crimes. If we can do something to stop that, then this is something worth standing for. This is worth the time and the effort. When we come here today, to go back to the old principle that I said, it's about M&Ms, monies, and morals. And that's the best place to be, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time and urge adoption of this act.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and concur in the Senate amendment to the House amendment to S. 756? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, 2/3 being in the affirmative, gentleman from Georgia.
I ask for the ayes.
Yeas and nays are requested. Those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number having arisen, recorded the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. Further proceedings on this question will be postponed.